Hi there. I want to welcome you to the Eliminating Caregiver Chaos little short podcast that we would like to do every couple of weeks. And the purpose behind this is just to give you something to listen to with some information, some content that will help you along your caregiving journey. And so I just want to welcome everyone that's listening. The idea here is that we know that you are busy and that sitting down to listen and watch a video is not always easy to do, especially if you're on the go as a caregiver. And so hopefully this is something that you can put your earphones on, download into your phone, and you can listen while you work. And hopefully it'll give you encouragement and some instruction on the caregiving journey. And so I just want to briefly introduce myself and my experience. My name is DJ Castilleja, and I wanted to take a little bit of time just to talk about my experience and what led me to begin and start up Eliminating Caregiver Chaos. Just a little bit about me. I started my adult career as a minister in churches. I lived in Central Texas at the time when I became an ordained minister, and I worked for about 8 years as an associate pastor. And in that time, I had the opportunity to help people. And I would give instruction on the Bible and help people along on their Christian journeys. It was shortly after that we moved to Kansas, where I went to seminary and got a formal Christian leader education. And I worked on my MDiv at seminary in Kansas City. And we were there for about 3 years. And during that time, I also worked as an associate pastor at a local church in a little town called Paola, Kansas, just south of Kansas City. And it wasn't long after that we were called to go to Canada. And that's where I became a senior pastor at a church. And it's also where we met, fostered, and adopted my son. ZZ is his name. And shortly after that, I was there for about 8 years. I moved back to Texas, and that's when I got involved in hospice. And I started out in hospice as a hospice chaplain and grief support, a bereavement coordinator, and a volunteer coordinator. I worked for a small hospice that was based in San Antonio, and that's where I gained a lot of experience in the hospice field. And I loved hospice so much. I learned it. I researched as much as I could about it. And shortly after that, 2 years later, I found myself as the executive director of the hospice. And I was there for 2 years throughout COVID. This is during the time of COVID, so I helped lead the agency through the COVID experience, which was crazy. As everyone knows, it was very crazy. And then I was asked to come on board with a little startup agency, a hospice agency, where I was also the administrator and operations director there as well. And after that, I moved back to Kansas. So I was a director for together 4 years, moved back to Kansas where I became a bereavement coordinator. And that's what I currently do right now for a pretty large corporate hospice agency that's in the southeast United States. And I'm based in Kansas, but my territories are in other states, in Oklahoma and North Carolina. And it was through my hospice experience that I really grew a heart for caregivers. You know, the patients that we helped in hospice, they're going through their process, but the ones that were sticking by them, you could tell were so stressed out, so overwhelmed. And thank goodness for the RNs and the social workers and chaplains that worked with them. But it was clear that many of them, a great majority, were going through caregiver burnout. And along the way, through my time in ministry and my time in the hospice industry, I had learned techniques that really helped deal with a lot of the stress that caregivers experience. And I've always had a heart to help people, which is why I started Eliminating Caregiver Chaos. It's the whole purpose we exist is to be there for our caregivers, the caregivers that had very little support. Many times they felt like they couldn't leave the home. They felt overwhelmed. And so that is the roots of Eliminating Caregiver Chaos and why we started this. And so this little podcast and Eliminating Caregiver Chaos is for caregivers, family caregivers caring for elderly loved ones. Many times they're parents or family members, and many times it's just thrown into the laps of the caregivers. It's for those who are feeling overwhelmed, burned out, and just feel lost in their role as caregivers. This podcast is for caregivers looking for practical strategies, emotional support, and community. And so we hope along the way that we're going to just impart to you helpful mindset tools that will help you in your caregiving journey. And so just a little bit of what to expect from this podcast. I hope to do this every 2 weeks at the bare minimum. But as much as I love talking about caregiving and the hospice industry, it may come out more frequent. In these episodes, we'll be covering key topics. It's my hope to cover different topics related to caregiving, what makes Eliminating Caregiver Chaos so different, which I think if you listen for a little bit, you give this a chance, give a few episodes a chance, you will see what makes Eliminating Caregiver Chaos so different than other caregiving coaching and caregiving instruction that you'll hear out there. It's about giving practical advice to caregivers, mindset shifts, which is what we're about. We're about the transformation of the caregiver mindset. And we hope to have real life caregiver stories. I hope to do some interviews with caregivers. I hope to do some interviews with people who help caregivers. I hope to have guest experts and experienced caregivers sharing their insights. And so it's going to be a mix of short and actionable episodes and deeper discussions. So in this particular first episode of this Caregiver podcast, I just want to share the 4 main differences that caregivers who go through Eliminating Caregiver Chaos or exposed to the mindset training of Eliminating Caregiver Chaos will experience. And the very first thing that you will hear us talking about is caregiver planning and how caregivers can stay organized and prepared for caregiving. We believe that planning for caregiving, no matter what stage of caregiving you are in, whether you are early before your loved one declines, or maybe you're already in the middle of caregiving, we believe that planning is essential. And you can start today. You can start right away. And so part of our training is to help caregivers plan. We give them tools. We give them how to plan, where to get started. And all you have to do is fill in the blanks. Our first whole training module is about caregiver planning. And this is what we say about caregiver planning. Planning allows you to prepare for the things you can control so that you will have the capacity to handle the things you can't control. And this is huge. This is an important mindset because so often people that land themselves into the caregiving role do not plan. They don't see it as necessary. But caregivers also sometimes fail to see all the things that are going to come up in the caregiving journey that you can't control. You cannot control when your loved one's going to accidentally have a fall. You can't control when they become ill or they get a UTI or they have to run off to the hospital. You can't control those things. And each of those have a lot of stress in itself. And then all of a sudden, it feels like things just unwind and get out of control. And then even the simple things that you could have prepared for become difficult to do. And so we encourage caregivers to plan so that they are prepared for the things they can control. That way they're able to manage and have the capacity to handle the things they can't control. And so that's the first module we teach. We teach about how to have a conversation, that first conversation with your loved one. When the topic of caregiving first comes up, an important discussion needs to happen. We talk about how to plan with your family and others. We talk about what documents you should have all prepared. Getting the POA, the power of attorney, the medical power of attorney. We talk about what those documents are. We talk about the DNR. We talk about financial planning. Like how are you going to pay for the caregiving journey? Who's going to pay for it? Is it the loved one that's going to pay for it? Is it the caregiver that's going to pay for it? And so there's so much to plan for. We teach about document organization. So when you do have to run off to the hospital, you have all your documents in one place, organized and ready to go. And so we want to give you as much preparation as possible in our planning module. The second module that we teach has to do with exercise, nutrition, and self-care. And these are all important things. Now, most of the time when you talk to someone that is a caregiver coach, this is what they're talking about. They talk about how to eat better. They talk about exercise. They talk about nutrition. They talk about taking care of yourself, meditating, prayer as the solution to your burnout. And we believe it's important. We believe it's very important, but it's not the solution in itself. In fact, many people who go into self-care while stressed out will just see it as another thing to add to their schedule, another thing to do, and the results will often be short-lived. Because when you talk about self-care, you're mainly dealing with the symptoms of caregiver burnout, not the underlying stress issues. And so we do believe self-care and good health is important, but it also has to be paired with dealing with the stress that caregivers go through. And that's module 3, dealing with the stress, the emotional things that come with caregiving. These things are less addressed in caregiving coaching, which makes the caregiver mindset and the Eliminating Caregiver Chaos process so different. And in this module, module 3, we talk about mindset training. Now, mindset simply is the set of beliefs you have around caregiving. And let's face it, where did we learn how to caregive? Where did we learn to emotionally manage the stresses dealing with caregiving? Did we learn this in school? No, we learned it by accident. You know, caregiving for many people just fell in our laps. And so we were never really trained for the caregiving experience. And so we want to give you practical mindset training on topics such as dealing with guilt. A lot of caregivers deal with guilt, but don't quite know how to process the stress. We also talk about fears. There's a huge fear, like the number one fear that caregivers go through is the fear of their loved one dying. Now, think about this. In my time in the hospice industry, the loved ones, the patients, are less afraid of dying than the ones that are caring for them. And what ends up happening is the caregiver begins to project their fear on the loved one, and the loved one gets stressed out about it to the point where they're giving in to the caregiver. And the caregiver doesn't realize that this extra stress that's being imparted onto their loved one is not helping the situation. And so we teach about the fear of death and what to think about that, how to shape our mindset around it. We talk about other things like the losses, the anticipatory grief that caregivers go through. Other topics will be topics like how to deal with your brothers and sisters that are just absent. I can't tell you that how many times I've heard, where are my loved ones? Why aren't they helping? Well, how do you deal with that? How do you manage the stress that's added to that? How do you deal with the anger and resentment that results from that? And so that's all part of the third module about the emotional mindset in caregiving. And then we decided to do a fourth module, and it's called the Life After Caregiving. This is a bonus module that we're doing, and it's preparing for what's to come next after our loved one passes. Very first off the bat is grief and bereavement. You go through a grief stage. We're going to talk about that. That's my specialty. That's what I do for a full-time living, is grief support. We're going to talk about what it looks like to vision your life, how to relaunch your life after caregiving. Caregivers are so consumed, so invested in the caregiving experience that all of a sudden when the loved one passes away and everything is done, what do I do next? It's like the whole identity of a caregiver can be invested into caregiving. And when that's taken away, a lot of times caregivers question, what do I do next? So we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about probate and all the after effects after someone passes away. And so that's what's in store with this podcast, with Eliminating Caregiver Chaos. And this is why I believe that this Eliminating Caregiver Chaos podcast is so important. Caregiving can feel so isolated, but you are not alone. And it's so important that caregivers get support, preparation, and mindset training in caregiving. My goal and my life purpose is to help caregivers reduce stress and avoid burnout. Above all things, that's what I want for caregivers. And so in the future episodes that will be coming up, we're going to be talking about different topics in caregiving. And so I encourage listeners to subscribe and share this podcast with your fellow caregivers. Share it with other people. This is free, it's accessible, and then invite them to join the Eliminating Caregiver Chaos community for additional support. And so I just want to thank everyone for putting in the 20 minutes it took to listen to this podcast, and just remind you that you don't have to do all of this alone. We are here for you. And if you want to learn more about Eliminating Caregiver Chaos, all you have to do is go to eliminatingcaregiverchaos.com, and you'll see the services that we have available. If you want to find me free of charge, you can go onto Facebook. I am one of the administrators of the Caregiver Support Group. It has a yellow logo. We just hit 10,000 members, and so it's growing. And I lead a free caregiver support group that's on Zoom for this group. And so far, I think we're on caregiver group number 10. It's been awesome. I love hearing the experiences of other caregivers. It's a time to share and to vent your experience and to come along and support and encourage others. And so I hope you'll join us for that. Look us up on the Facebook group. You can look me up on Facebook. My name is DJ Castilleja. Find me on Facebook. I'd be happy to chat with you. If you just want to have a discovery call with me, you can schedule that through eliminatingcaregiverchaos.com and just contact me, and I would love to meet you, and I hope this will be a blessing for you in the future. Thanks for listening.